Welcome to Coffee with Democrats, a sensible platform for progressive conversations. Coffee with Democrats is a grassroots movement dedicated to hearing from Democrats, candidates, legislators, and friends from all political backgrounds who want great conversations. Coffee with Democrats is committed to increase Democrat voter registration and Democrat voter turnout by making voting more exciting and meaningful. And now here's your host of Coffee with Democrats, Kevin Dawson.
Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Democrats. My name is Kevin Dawson, co-founder of Coffee with Democrats, and we are proud to provide you this presentation by Beto O'Rourke this morning. Please enjoy. Thank you.
About Mr. O'Rourke, how special he is, how significant his presence in the political sphere is. Yes. We know the big buzzwords are energetic, charismatic. These words perhaps contrast to most people's image of a politician. But I think a neglected buzzword that I might nominate is big-hearted. I think I don't know him personally, but from the few texts that we exchanged, as well as my following his candidacies, I get the sense that he's a very big-hearted person. And I think that comes across in his choice of topic tonight, which is voting rights. Voting rights are routinely made difficult to obtain, kept out of reach from some of the most vulnerable populations in the United States. And I think fighting on their behalf and fighting for those voices to be made manifest in our political process, that takes a big heart to do. I've got two more sentences and I'm going to hand the microphone. We're going to have a talk from Mr. Beto. I believe he's going to talk. I hope so. We're going to have a Q&A period during which I'm going to walk around with the mic and we'll try and take as many questions as we can within reason. And then following the Q&A period, we're going to bring Mr. O'Rourke into the bookstore where he's going to have a shiny signing author table. And he's just going to take the most orderly line of people. It's going to wind through the main entrance of the bookstore, that two double-doored entrance, and it's going to wind into the cafe, and that's where we're going to have him in front of the fireplace. I think I've run out of things to say, so again, Mr. Beto O'Rourke.
All right, Stephen, thank you for the introduction, for bringing me out here, for opening your doors, to getting all these good people to come together tonight in Oklahoma City. It's really wonderful to be back, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say, hearing what's on your mind, answering your questions if you have any for me. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. For the last 8 days, I've been traveling to different parts of the country, all by automobile. I've got about 2,600 miles on the car over these last 8 days, talking about what's happening in our country, what has happened in our country, and what might happen in our country. And it's one thing for me to talk about it or to write about it. It's another thing to be in dialogue and conversation with you about it. And that's what I've enjoyed the most. And I'm doing this, I've been in political campaigns before. I've run for city council, Congress, Senate, governor. I've won some of them, I've lost some of them. But usually you're traveling with a really big team. Folks who are doing the advance work for you, who are helping you along the way. And there's no other way I could have done that but with the team that I had. What's been really interesting about these last 8 days is I'm just by myself going from town to town. And it really reminds me of, more than 30 years ago, out of El Paso, Texas, where I'm from, where I was born and raised, we started a punk rock band. And the whole ethic of punk rock is you were outside of the system of corporate music. So you're writing your own songs, you're playing your own instruments, of course, you're putting on your own shows, you're starting your own record label, you're booking your own tour, And that's what we did. And we went city to city all over the country. In fact, I was in Little Rock last night at a book event like this one, and I remembered playing in Little Rock in 1994 at this pavilion in a park next to the river. And then afterwards playing kickball with a bunch of punk rockers at the time in the 90s and staying at someone's house. You were totally dependent on the kindness of strangers, like Stephen, who was a stranger to me before we had a chance to meet today. Folks who let you sleep on their floor or their couch, who let you play music in their living room. That was punk rock. And there's something about what we're doing tonight that feels like that. It's someone coming to your town and telling their story, which we would do through our songs. And it's also coming to your town and listening to your story, which would happen through songs from those other punk rock bands. Interesting thing, the first night of this book tour, last Wednesday, was in Minot, North Dakota. And before I give the book talk at the bookstore there, Main Street Books, I go across the street to the record shop and just flipping through records. And the guy behind the counter says, "I saw you when you played Minot, North Dakota in 1994, 30 years ago." And from behind the counter, he produces the single that we had sold him 30 years ago and has me sign it for him. I posted a picture of him and the single on my Instagram account. You know, when I looked at him across the counter, I was like, that dude is old. 30 years ago, he was the same age I was 30 years ago. We're the same age today, so I am old as well. No, it's been great. It's been really wonderful. After playing punk rock, finishing school, I moved back to Texas, started a small business, met my wife, Amy. We started a family there, best thing that's ever happened to me, and served on the city council. Got to serve in the United States House of Representatives, honor of a lifetime on the Veterans Affairs Committee and the Armed Services Committee, getting to help those who put their lives on the line for this country, literally, and in many cases, the family members of those who gave their lives to this country, literally. The least partisan committees that you can find in a deeply divided, highly polarized country right now. It made me so proud to be in that position, to be serving this country, and to be an American in this great democracy. In 2016, something changed for me. Maybe it did for you. Donald Trump, against every expectation that I had, was elected to the highest position of public trust and power in America. Here was a guy who was talking about my hometown of El Paso, Texas, which happens to be one of the safest places anywhere in America, not despite, but because it is a city of immigrants. Describing it as a war zone, as the front line of this invasion of brown people who were coming to get us, to rape us, to kill us, to commit crimes in this country. Certainly what I had been doing in my life had been insufficient to the task at hand. What all of us were doing in our lives was insufficient to stopping this threat to our country. And literally on that night, I'm watching the election returns with Amy, and we turned to each other. And you know what this feels like if you've been married for a while. We knew what the other was thinking, which is that we've got to do something more. And that decision that we made that night that seemed almost ridiculous on its face at the time was that we were going to run for the United States Senate against Ted Cruz, a guy who was the runner-up in the Republican nomination that year. But for Donald Trump, he would have been a major party candidate for the presidency. The guy had money coming out of his ears. Name recognition, blanketing the state of Texas. I was an unknown member of Congress from far west Texas who had sworn off PAC money, meaning I don't take money from corporations or political action committees, just from real, live human beings. And somehow in a state that had last elected a Democrat to the Senate in 1988, we thought we had a chance. And really, we were the only ones who thought we had a chance at the outset. We made a virtue of a necessity. We didn't have money, we didn't have name ID, so we just hit the road. And we traveled to literally every single one of the 254 counties in Texas. You could not be too red for us to show up, because I wanted to make sure that you knew that I was not going to write you off. You could not be too blue for us to show up, because I wanted to make sure that we did not take you for granted. In meetings like these, just in every single one of those counties, I learned so much made so many friends, became such a stronger candidate, and I think a better human being for it. We did that for almost 2 years straight, nonstop, on the road, living out of a van or a car, again, dependent on the kindness of strangers. And sure enough, that strategy, which seemed absolutely impossible at the outset, began to pay off. Before you knew it, people thought, well, maybe this guy really does have a chance. And though we didn't take PAC money, and folks were contributing $5, 10, 15 bucks at a time, we ended up raising $80 million in that race, which was the record for a Senate race in world history, not just America. Like, nobody had raised that much money running for the Senate in forever. We didn't beat Ted Cruz, as you know. We came very close, 2.5 points. I'm sorry about that. Every day, I'm sorry about that. But some amazing things happened along the way. We produced more votes in a Texas election than had ever occurred before. More votes for a Democrat than had ever been won before. In fact, for the first time since 1964, when Lyndon Baines Johnson was on the ballot, we won the 5 major metro areas in Texas. Young people who we did not sleep on or give up on, and didn't cynically decide, because they don't vote, we're not going to show up, because we understood that maybe they're not voting because no one shows up. We went to every college, every high school campus we could, every junior college, every electrician's or welder's apprenticeship program, and we met the people who have the most to gain or to lose in that election, and young voter turnout was up 500% from the previous midterm election. And though we didn't defeat Cruz on election night in November of 2018, other Democrats did win their races up and down the ballot. 12 insurgent Democrats defeated 12 incumbent Republicans in the state house. We won commissioners' court seats. We won court of appeals seats. And in Harris County, home to Houston, Texas, a county that is bigger by population than the state of Nevada, home to the most diverse city in America, 18 Black women won election to judicial positions on that night, literally changing the face of criminal justice in the process. Those who ran that campaign, like my friend Mary Lou Tebebot, who's in the back from Longview, we really did something together that no one thought was possible and forever transformed the state. Now, that wasn't lost on the other side. They knew exactly what we had done, and they knew what was to follow unless they could change something. And they changed our election laws. In 2019, the next time that the Texas legislature meets, they make it even harder for people to vote in a state that is already the hardest in the union in which to cast a ballot or to register or to have your name on the rolls. In 2021, they double down, they do it again. And you might remember the Texas Democratic State House legislators literally left the state of Texas under threat of arrest and imprisonment to try to deny Republicans and Governor Greg Abbott the quorum to change our election laws and fundamentally undermine our democracy. Well, takes you to 2022 when I'm running for governor, and on a ballot where it wasn't just Beto O'Rourke and Greg Abbott, but it was the children of Uvalde. It was the women who could no longer make their own decisions about their own body, their own future, and their own health care. It was a state that is the least insured in the nation, meaning more kids die of diabetes. That is so fundamentally fucked up. It is the most preventable disease to die from, and the people who are succumbing to it are kids right now. We are a state who in 2021, when it got cold, despite the fact that we are the energy capital of the world, couldn't keep the power on or the heat flowing or the water running because it had frozen in the pipes. 700 human beings died. Most of them froze to death, including an 11-year-old child in Conroe, Texas, whose mom could not pile enough blankets on his shivering body. And in the morning, when she woke up, he never did again. All of that's on the ballot. 9.5 million eligible Texans did not cast a ballot. What gives? It's not that they don't care. It's not that they're lazy. It's not that they lack any love for this great democracy. It is because they have been drawn out of the ability to participate and to play. They're on the sidelines and not in the field. because in those two legislative sessions that I described, they made Texas not just the hardest to vote, but they made it hard for people who didn't look like me, but who've been the targets of voter suppression and voter intimidation, frankly, for as long as we have been a country. The very young, the very old, the very poor, Black and brown Texans who are cynically assumed to only be voting for Democrats. So we're going to make it almost impossible for them to vote. What do I mean by that? The strictest voter ID law in the country. I mean 700 polling place closures, twice the number of the next closest state, even though we are the fastest growing state. We should be opening up more polling locations. Instead, we closed 700, almost all of them in fast growing Black and brown neighborhoods across Texas. So on election night, you will see this in 2024 as you've seen it every year since those laws were passed. Lines stretch 7-8 hours long outside of Texas Southern University, one of our great historically Black colleges. And part of you seeing that line of people who waited the entire day to vote makes you proud that they would be willing to do so. But I hope the rest of you is so deeply embarrassed and ashamed that we would ever subject another US citizen to this indignity. And for everyone who can stay in line, imagine those in a state where the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, who if they're working one of those jobs, they are working 3 of those jobs, who just cannot afford literally to vote, or they're taking care of their kids or their elderly parents, or they just say, you know what, the hell with it. I'm not going to wait 8 hours to cast a ballot. That is what is happening in Texas right now. And really, that is the impetus for this book. We've got to try. How do we overcome this? And actually, on a personal level, how do we overcome the temptation to despair in the face of these challenges? It is enough to make you want to give up. But when I think about it, Oklahoma and Texas, this is where the fight is. And these states, this is where the fight has always been. The central character of this book is a guy named Lawrence Aaron Nixon, who was born not too far from where Mary Lou lives. He was born in Marshall, Texas, which in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, the time of his birth, was still a Confederate stronghold, even though the issue had been decided in 1865. Growing up a Black man in that community was beyond challenging. Nonetheless, he graduates from Wiley College, finishes his postgraduate work in Tennessee, comes back to Texas, a medical doctor, and finds his way to El Paso in 1910. Now, El Paso is still under Jim Crow, still in the former Confederacy, but it is also connected to Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico. And there's this beautiful, benign influence that we get from our neighbors across the river. Langston Hughes, who on one of his book tours is visiting El Paso around this time, talks about crossing the river, going to one of the bars in Juarez, maybe the Kentucky Club, where they claim to have invented the margarita. He talks about how sitting at that bar, he's rubbing shoulders with white folks, with brown folks, with Black folks just like him. And those differences have no distinction on that side of the border, although they will as soon as he crosses back north. And yet it's still a little bit different in El Paso. Nixon lands in the El Paso neighborhood of Segundo Barrio. This was and still is the defining immigrant neighborhood, not just of El Paso, not just of Texas, but I would argue of the United States. Millions of American families can trace their first footsteps in Segundo Barrio. Nixon learns Spanish so he can better care for his patients. I think he charges no more than $2 for an inpatient visit, and house calls no more than $4, because he wants to make sure that those for whom he is caring can actually afford the care, get better, and lead the best lives they possibly can. This guy is as civically engaged as a man, especially a Black man at the time, could be. In fact, he founds the first chapter of the NAACP anywhere in the state of Texas, in El Paso in 1915. He designs the bond issues that his fellow citizens will be voting on, and he never misses an election. Until in 1923, 101 years ago, the Texas state legislature forbids voting by Black Texans. And to be clear, they didn't do it euphemistically as was done in other states. It's not a literacy test that you have to pass. It's not an exorbitant poll tax which you must have to pay. It's not a grandfather clause under which you must qualify, which absolutely disqualifies every African American because their grandparents were enslaved and will never be able to vote. No, in black and white, it says if you're black, you cannot vote in Texas. So imagine this, the next year, 1924, a critically important election year in Texas, as it was in Oklahoma. Remember, this is the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan across America, especially in our two states. And now every African American in Texas is now legally forbidden from casting a ballot. Lawrence Nixon, nonetheless, pays his poll tax, takes his poll tax receipt to fire station number 5, his typical polling location, patiently waits in line, and when he gets to the front of it, the election judge and the poll worker, who recognize him on site because Nixon's never missed an election, say, "Dr. Nixon, you know we can't let you vote." And Nixon responds, "I know you can't, but I've got to try." He takes his case to the local district court and loses it immediately. But he appeals it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1927 wins this signal Supreme Court victory that at least momentarily breaks the white primary in Texas, only to have the state legislature convene under an immediate emergency session and rewrite the laws to work around the Supreme Court decision. Nixon, undeterred, continues to pay his poll tax, continues to vote, continues to challenge it legally, wins a second Supreme Court victory in 1934, only to have the legislature find another workaround. It won't be until 1944, 20 years after he began this fight, that in the Smith versus Allwright decision, you nominally at least have the integration of elections in Texas. 20 years. You think about the challenges that we're up against, how brokenhearted we are when our candidate or our party does not win a given election in a given election cycle. The despair that we feel, or at least tempted to give into, when things do not go our way in the immediate time frame of right now. And this guy, for 20 years, knowing not when or even if he would ever overcome that white primary, never gave up, never gave in, knew that he had to try. To put a point on this, the radio station, or one of them in El Paso, in the midst of all this, took to calling him every election day and putting him on air. "Dr. Nixon, are you planning to vote today?" And of course, Nixon would say, "Yes, I'm going to try to vote today." Now, when I read that anecdote, you can read it one of two ways. Either that radio DJ is trying to amplify Nixon's courage and help other people in El Paso take heart from his example, or he's making fun of him, mocking Nixon, putting him on air for entertainment. How humiliating it must have been for that guy, how his family must have questioned whether he was doing the right thing. Please just give up, go back to your practice, let's make some money, let's move to another state where we're treated like full human beings and US citizens. But no, he never gave in. And it wasn't just 1944 that he made possible. 21 years after that, the first president from the state of Texas is in the Oval Office. And he's meeting with Dr. King and Andrew Young. And it's just on the heels of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Johnson burned all the political capital he had to get passed, famously predicting that he would lose the South for a generation for the Democratic Party. He just had it off by like 6 or 7 generations, but generally he was correct. King is purported to have said, "Mr. President, amazing job. This country owes you an enormous debt of gratitude. But now we would like to vote." Because despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act, it was still functionally illegal or prohibitive for African Americans to vote in Texas, perhaps in Oklahoma, but in Louisiana, Mississippi, you name it, if you were part of the Confederacy at one time, you could not vote then in 1965. Johnson says, "You're right, I'd love to help, but I just don't have the power to get it done. And as they're leaving, a dejected Young turns to King and says, "What are we going to do?" And King responds, "We're going to go out there and get this guy some power." Over the coming days, weeks, and months, everyday people, and I mean everyday people, just like you and just like me, took to the streets, to the State House steps. They wrote their members of Congress. They lit up the switchboard at the White House, and they made their presence and their power felt. Until you get to March of that year, when a 24-year-old John Lewis leads a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, calling for voting rights. Well, not only are he and the marchers there, not only the police who beat them within an inch of their lives, but so are television cameras who are beaming the images all across the country, and for that matter, all across the world. It shocks the conscience of America, and it galvanizes the president into political action. Within 8 days, that is light speed in politics, he convenes a joint session of Congress. And he says something to the effect of, look, as it was Lexington and Concord during our war for revolution, as it was at that courthouse in Appomattox in 1865, so it is today that courageous Americans are willingly putting their lives down for this great democracy to help us fulfill the promise that we first made when we started this experiment. Ladies and gentlemen, and it was almost all gentlemen, of the House and the Senate, you have the power to confer that right that they are marching for, that is justifiably theirs if we will only grant it. By the summer of that year, he's able to sign into law the Voting Rights Act of '65, for the first time creating a multiracial democracy in America. Now that happened because of LBJ and King and Young, John Lewis, and millions others whose names will never be sung or known, but who were critical to the effort. And that happened because of Nixon and the courage of his convictions at that polling place in 1924, saying, "I've got to try." In 1975, the first Black woman to represent a congressional district from Texas reauthorizes the Voting Rights Act, this time to include language minorities. So all of those Spanish-speaking farm workers in the Rio Grande Valley, and Donna, and Harlingen, and McAllen, and Brownsville, who are literally putting the food on the tables of their fellow Texans and Americans, now they can vote because they can understand the language on the ballot. They can run for office and hold positions of power as well. They can transform this American democracy to look like the people that it purports to represent. It's reauthorized again in the 80s, then in the 90s. We are on a steady path of progress. The arc of the moral universe is bending towards justice. We don't even have to try anymore until 2013, when the Supreme Court says, all right, history is over, racism is gone, we don't have this problem anymore, and in our infinite wisdom, we are going to strike down the Voting Rights Act. States, do as you will. Within minutes, literally, and this is not an exaggeration, within minutes, Texas imposes that first round of voter ID requirements. Texas begins closing down those polling place locations. Texas begins to redraw congressional districts, ensuring that if you're Black or brown, you're drawn out of a district where your vote might change the outcome into one where your vote has no hope of doing anything at all. No wonder some people decide not to vote. And for those of us who are tempted to get on our high horse and preach down at them, let us think about where they are right now and what put them there in the first place. And it doesn't just stop with voting rights in our democracy. The outcome is very personal and very mortal. You do not get a total abortion ban in Texas, Oklahoma, or Arkansas, where I was last night, unless you have disenfranchised functionally and effectively millions of Texans, including millions of women, from being able to decide the outcome of those elections. You don't get the Uvalde massacre, where an 18-year-old can freely buy not one, but two AR-15s, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, even though his friends referred to him as the school shooter before he ever walked into a single school classroom and shot a single child. You don't get that if people are voting and able to vote their values and decide their future. You don't get the least insured state in America. You don't get all of the things that define us right now. You don't get a 16-year-old child in Oklahoma literally bullied to death because of who they are and how they express themselves in a fully functioning democracy. They didn't just take the life of our country away from us. They're taking the lives of our fellow Americans as we sit here today. What's the lesson? The lesson is that we've got to try. The lesson is that action like Nixon's, like Lewis, like Johnson, like everyone who followed in their footsteps, is not just the key to victory, it is the antidote to despair. Being in this game, having agency, getting off the sidelines, voting for sure, that's the bar to entry, but registering others, volunteering, running for office. I just learned that someone at this bookstore just won a seat on a local school board and is going to be sworn in this week. Do I have that right? That's amazing. That's action. The lesson is, victory is never final. For those who thought that the fight was over in 1965 or when it was reauthorized in 75, when it comes to the Voting Rights Act, how rudely they were awakened in 2013. And now we're working from a deficit. We're deep in a hole that we're having a very hard time getting out of it. What if we were vigilant all along? What if we understood that those victories, though hard won, hard fought, and should be celebrated, are never going to be final? Which brings me to my third lesson. This fight is never over. For as long as we draw a breath, we must commit ourselves to it. Now that can sound daunting and maybe downright depressing. Many of us in this age of convenience would like to think, well, I can just press a button or just vote this one time, or Barack Obama was elected, I can go home now. The country's going to be saved. The cavalry has ridden to our rescue. No, actually, when he wins that election, that's when he needs us more than ever. I'll give you another example that comes from Texas. In '72, abortion was just illegal in my home state as it is today. But there were three incredibly courageous women. One who went by the name Jane Roe for legal purposes. Her two attorneys, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, they prevail upon an all-male United States Supreme Court so that by 1973 in the Roe versus Wade decision, that court has enshrined in constitutional protection the right to privacy, to make your own decisions about your own body and your own future. I think many people, myself included, believed that was the end of the argument. The matter had been settled. The other side, they got that last lesson. The fight is never over. And for 49 years, patiently and persistently, they weakened that law. They kept their eyes on the prize. They focused on local benches, local elections, built up political power until they gained a majority on the United States Supreme Court. And not just a majority that struck down Roe versus Wade, but a majority that included the consenting opinion of Clarence Thomas, who told us, if you thought we were going to stop at abortion, marriage equality is next. After that, I come for contraception. The things that we have taken for granted and seem like they would be hard to believe in a Margaret Atwood novel are coming true in our states and in our country right now. So it is daunting, but also when we accept it, we can find joy in it. Being on the doors, registering people to vote, getting behind candidates, running for office, you're no longer letting it happen to you, you are happening to it. You are off the sidelines in the game. There's nothing more depressing for me than reading Twitter or watching the news or hearing about bad things happening to good people. There's nothing more encouraging and joyful to me than getting out there and fighting for those very same people to protect others who will become the victims of this injustice if I fail to stand up and to be counted. And you know what? I want to tell you right now to give you some encouragement and hope and optimism. It is working. Who would have thought in 2022 that super liberal state of Kansas would overwhelmingly pass by ballot the protection for abortion? That Ohio would do it the next year. And in Little Rock last night, as I was walking into the bookstore talk there were three people, each of whom had a clipboard, getting petition signatures for a ballot initiative to enshrine the right to make your own decisions about your own body in that state as well, okay? So we're on the march, we're doing the work, but this is the test of all tests, because it's not just everything that I described, and I'll close with this. It is the fact that this democracy, the subject of this book, much of what I've spoken tonight, hopefully some of what you're going to ask me about, it's not just under attack in our state legislatures and the weakening of voter protections and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in that 2013 decision. It is that you have a major party candidate who right now in broad daylight has promised us that on day one, he will be a dictator, who has shown us on January 6th of 2021 that he will use violence to be able to stop the peaceful transfer of power after a legitimately decided, lawful, democratic election. That he does not believe in these fundamental values that make us the greatest country that the world has ever known. And in fact, is talking about things that could have been lifted from Mein Kampf or right out of the mouth of Adolf Hitler, talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of America, openly musing about executing the Chief of Staff of the United States Army and somebody who sat as a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Imagine the people of the future reading about the people of 2024. They won't believe it. You mean to tell me that somebody openly said they're going to be a dictator, did all this crazy shit, was under indictment in so many different states and under the federal government as well, trying to overturn elections that have been peacefully decided for almost 247 years straight. And you guys let him win power? And you brought this great democracy down so that it will never live again? So, no pressure, folks, but we cannot fuck this one up. The future is counting on us, and we've got to count it. Are you with me? All right. So we've got to try. We've got to try. We've got to try. Now I would like to hear from you, and I think Stephen is going to take the microphone through. I was asking him if we were going to do this based on what hand goes up or pre-filled questions, but we're just going to take this as people raise their hand, right? And nothing's off the table, nothing off limits. Would like to hear what you're thinking about, and I'll do my best to respond quickly so we get as many voices into the conversation. Está bien? Okay.
Así es.
Any of you old enough to remember Phil Donahue?
Oh, yeah.
And he'd like take the microphone into the audience. That was lost on Stephen because he's too young.
Hi. The death of Alexei Navalny has been weighing really heavily on me, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that and what lessons American citizens who care about democracy should take from his life and death.
Thank you for asking that great question. I mean, what a hero. He's poisoned by Putin, almost killed. He's on a flight when he realizes he's about to die the first time. They make an emergency landing. They are able to resuscitate him, keep him alive. He desperately wants to get out of Russia because he knows they're trying to kill him. Ultimately, they let him leave to Germany, where they find that he's been poisoned by a radioactive substance. That is the signature of the Putin regime. They killed others who they deem as traitors in England and other places that very same way. He recuperates, he recovers, he continues to lead the opposition from afar, and then he willingly goes back into Russia, knowing that in so doing, he is signing his death warrant. But doing so because he so believes in what we're talking about right now, the ability to freely and fairly decide our future, to not have to live under a despot or an autocrat or a dictator or a strongman like Vladimir Putin. You know, that guy is walking in the same tradition of Martin Luther King. As you all know, he predicted his death. He knew exactly what he was doing by speaking truth to power and fighting for this democracy and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act before it. The same footsteps that John Lewis walked, who almost lost his life in that same way. So these guys should serve as our inspiration, and these women who've done the same thing should serve as our inspiration. I'm not asking anybody here to give their lives. But I am asking everyone here to do what they can with what they have, where they are. Think about it this way. Whether it's Navalny, whether it's Lewis, whether it's Septima Clark, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr., we have inherited their sacrifice. We are their heirs. We are only here right now because of what they made possible. Now, what we do with this inheritance, that's going to determine our future and our fate as a country. And it's going to define us in the eyes of our kids and the pages of history. And if you're like me, your kids are your conscience. And I want to be able to answer them when they ask that question down the road. Hey, Dad, when all this was going on, what did you do? Did you take it? Did you accept it? Did you give in? Did you give up? No, we stood and we fought and we won. And so for people like Navalny, or people like Lawrence Nixon, who died before he really got to see the fruits of his labor, just know this, they're like that old saying, they planted the seed of the tree whose shade they will never sit under, but for them, we wouldn't be sitting under it right now. So let us not squander this gift that we have been given. Let's jealously guard it, defend it, and fight for it. And that's what I take from Navalny and others like him. Thanks for asking.
So first and foremost, thank you for coming and talking to us. So my question is more focused on the reality of a certain. So my folks are from Minsk when they left the Soviet Union, and they didn't have the benefit of, while they were under the Soviet regime, to choose their leaders. They instilled in me the idea of it is up to us to make sure our leaders are accountable. Back in 2016 and in 2020, the push has been very clear. Trump is doing awful, horrible things, and we're campaigning against them. In that concept, though, the ratchet effect has been increasing. Instead of just campaigning for something, for voters' rights, for suffrage, we're campaigning against something. As this continues to escalate, as conflicts across the world escalate, what guarantee is that, well, yes, Trump is the no-win option, that in this pursuit to solve that problem, we're not allowing our executive, our legislature, to just get by with, oh, we're not the other guy. What's that protection we have as people to make sure our government, the alternative is much, much worse, but to make sure we're not settling for something lesser, people that actually want what's best for our country as a whole.
What a great question. And it makes me think of 2016, where whether it was fair or not, the way that many people understood Secretary Hillary Clinton's candidacy was that she was stopping Trump, and that Trump was a really terrible guy who had said and done terrible things, and that he would be a terrible president. All that is true. But despite her extraordinary expertise and experience, and she probably had a 10-point plan for everything that you could imagine, we weren't, many of us weren't voting for something. We couldn't articulate that. I don't know if it was the candidate or the messaging or the moment or what, but I remember this, I was in Congress at the time. And this was before the nomination had been decided. And every Tuesday or Wednesday, the Democratic caucus, all the Democratic members of the House would get together, and I would go to those meetings because there was a free breakfast and hot coffee, but also go to listen to speakers. And we had Secretary Clinton come and speak to us and make her case for the nomination. She did a terrific job, but she centered much of her talk on that thread. And then we had Senator Bernie Sanders come and talk to us, who was a very unpopular man at that moment. It was towards the end of the nominating process, and folks were like, "Hey, buddy, get out of the way. We need to solidify behind our candidate, and you're making this rough." And he didn't get a softball question from anybody. He basically got questions like that from everyone. And finally, he said, "You know what? The reason I'm in this race is because I'm talking about issues like universal health care, or being able to afford college tuition. The things that matter to people in their lives that they can vote for. It will not be enough for us to simply vote against this guy." That lesson has stayed with me, and I feel it very strongly right now. And what I would encourage the president to do, who I think has done a fantastic job, whether it's confronting climate change, reducing childhood poverty, investing in manufacturing in America again, and doing it with very slim majorities and very often with Republican majorities. I voted for him in the Texas primary, which started last Tuesday. I'll vote for him again in November. However, that all was behind us. What do we have to look forward to? The president needs to make that case. And I'll give you an issue. This is going to sound totally counterintuitive and maybe just downright dumb to you, but hear me out. Immigration might very well be the issue upon which this election turns. And I mentioned what Trump has said, and you know that it's not just poisoning the blood of our country. He describes immigrants as animals, as an infestation. That's his word. That's how you describe a cockroach that you want to exterminate. That's how you get people to put kids in cages and separate children from their mothers at the border after a 2,000-mile journey, sending mom back to Honduras and keeping the child here in foster care with the two, too often, never to meet again. That doesn't happen unless you have someone like Donald Trump. But right now, we have too many Democrats who are only talking about immigration as a security problem, who are talking about shutting the border down, who are not fighting for dreamers or a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented here, who are working the toughest, crappiest jobs that can possibly be worked in this country right now. Visit a slaughterhouse, a construction site, an agricultural field, and there's a better chance than not that it is an immigrant who is working that job today. I want my party, and I would love my president, though he's done a pretty good job on this, he could do even better, to say, you know what? We are the party of immigration, and we're going to find a safe and legal and orderly path for people to come here and work some of the 9 million jobs for which we cannot find an American to employ. We're going to allow them to come here to join their families, to build up our communities, to revitalize and strengthen our country. I know the polls say that this is all wrong, but the polls are only reflecting what has been spoken about so far, and no one has said that. And I bet you if the president would say that on immigration, he would supercharge so many of us who are already for him, but would now go through walls for him. He'd get young people who are understandably cynical about politics in America right now. They'd see this guy sticking his neck out for them and an issue that they care about. So that's just one thing that I think he could do to talk about what the future would look like with a second Biden administration. We need more of that, and I hope and I think the president will bring more of that to bear in the coming months. But you know what? To just go back to that example I gave you, we got to get the president some power. You know, sometimes those presidents need us to push them. You can support him and push him at the same time, and I think that's only democratic to do. Thanks for asking.
Hi. So first of all, just wanted to say my mom was born and raised in El Paso, Texas.
All right.
So huge shout out. I did vote for you back in 2022 in the governor election. That did not go my way, but just wanted to say.
Thank you.
Really quick. I was wondering, like, as a chronically Texan person, how I wanted to hear your thoughts on the intense voter suppression happening in Texas. Like you've been saying for the past, I don't know how many minutes, and especially now that we've mentioned, you know, the undocumented people that are struggling specifically in Texas and in El Paso, and finding legal ways to gain citizenship so that way you can vote at all. I just would like to hear kind of your thoughts on what we can do to promote that, to encourage that, and to put legislation into place that would ensure that that can come to pass.
Thanks for asking. You know, we absolutely must go on offense. And I'm talking about Democrats, and I acknowledge not everyone here is a Democrat. We might have independents, we might have Republicans, we might have folks who are just completely unaffiliated and uninterested in voting, and this is just where you hang out every Wednesday evening. But whatever brought you here, whatever persuasion you might be, my party is really just borne the brunt of this. And my people, and I mean the people of El Paso, almost certainly have more than anyone else. You know, in 2019, this rhetoric of invasion, of infestation, of animals, of criminals, of rapists, of brown people coming to get us, that came home to us. And it came home to us not too long after a rally in Florida, where the president's going on about all this stuff, and he says, what are we gonna do about it? And someone in the crowd yells out, shoot them. Everyone laughs, and they're applauding, and the president is smirking and smiling as if to say exactly. A few months later, troubled young guy from Allen, Texas, in the north part of our state, you're familiar with that part of Texas, buys an AK-47, which in itself is so disturbing to his mom that she calls the Allen police and says, I have no idea what my son wants with this weapon of war, but I'm really worried. We don't have a red flag law in Texas. So the police say, you know what, perfectly legal, you're on your own, good luck. He drives 600 miles to El Paso, Texas, and he walks into a Walmart on the last Saturday before the school year starts. So it's jam-packed with kids and their parents and their grandparents buying notebooks and backpacks and all that stuff. And right before he walks in, he posts a manifesto online, echoing the language of Donald Trump and Greg Abbott and these people who have described immigrants as an invasion, saying that he is now part of the army that is going to repel this invasion, that is going to politically take over Texas. And he shoots and kills 23 people in a matter of minutes in a city that doesn't lose 20 people in a given year to murder. And when the police pick him up afterwards, he says, I came here to kill Mexicans. So what are we doing on our side? I'm present company excluded, but those who represent us in Congress, in the Senate, in the White House, we had a majority in 2021. We say we believe in this stuff and we're fighting for these folks. And what are we doing? And why are our Senate negotiators negotiating a deal that has accepted every single Republican policy position to further clamp down the border, to reduce legal means of coming to this country, only ensuring that more people will cross in between ports of entry, and in so doing, more people will die. 2 years ago, record deaths on our southern border. Last year, we doubled the number of record deaths. These are moms and kids who are drowning in the Rio Grande, people who are dying of dehydration and exposure in the Chihuahua Desert. These are human beings, as vulnerable as you can possibly come. You've just traveled 2,000 miles. You don't have a dime to your name, and you fled that country to protect that child that you're with, who herself is going to lose her life in the process because we can't figure it out. You all probably know the story of the SS St. Louis. It set sail from, I think, Hamburg in 1938, 750 más o menos Jewish refugees who are trying to escape, their fate. They try to dock in Cuba. Cuba rejects them. They try to dock in America. This is totally appropriate, the comparison. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, think of a more liberal, progressive icon in our pantheon. His administration sends the St. Louis back to Europe, where hundreds of her passengers, men, women, and children, will perish in the death camps under the Nazis. Understandably, we are ashamed of that moment in our history. We all would like to say, hey, if I were alive in 1938, no way in hell would I allow that to happen. I would be protesting, I'd be standing up for them. But we're there right now. We are there right now. And what are we doing? And so again, I say support, but push. And you're going to have our votes, but you're going to have our votes because you are going to inspire us with what you're going to do. So to answer your question, that means a pathway to citizenship for those 11 million who are here right now. Certainly for the dreamers, like you came here when you were 3 months old. You're teaching school right now in Oklahoma City or El Paso. You're raising your family of U.S. citizen children. You're paying taxes. You're contributing to our success, and we are denying you the right to vote. But one last thing on this. You've heard this argument. I just want to prepare you for it when you start to advocate. Republicans think that Democrats are all about opening the border and allowing illegal immigrants in so that they can vote, which is crazy, but which led that guy to kill those 23 people in El Paso. And on the heels of that, do you remember when there were hundreds of Haitian migrants under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas, a couple of years ago? Dan Patrick, our lieutenant governor, one of the most powerful positions in the state of Texas, he goes on Fox News and he says, look, if we allow those Haitians into our country, they're going to have kids, and those kids are going to grow up to be Democrats, and they're going to vote us out of power. They're going to replace us. If you've heard about replacement theory, it doesn't live on the fringe of the internet. It lives in the halls of power in Texas and all over this country right now. So please, I love that you asked the question. Now we've got to stand up and fight together and push those who have power on our side to do the right thing. Thank you.
I hope you run for president.
Thank you.
And when you ran for Senate, I just want you to know that in Oklahoma City, you had signs for your Senate race.
Awesome.
And you ran, so big
Yes.
fan. Mike, I'm just curious, have you gone to the border outside of El Paso? Have you seen, like, I want to know what your experience is and what your takeaway is, because I know that we're hammered with a lot of information about it. It causes me a lot of distress because it's just so wrong. And I'd like some feedback from you about that.
Think about it this way. This thought occurred to me the other day. On the economy, you can't fool us because we experience it directly. I know how much milk costs. I know what a gallon of gas that I just put into that Chevy Equinox that I rented in Minot, North Dakota costs. That's my lived, real experience. You know, you can try to spin it, you can try to claim credit for it, but I know what I'm feeling, I know what it costs. Now, immigration, to your point, is something that you're told how to feel about. Unless you yourself are an immigrant, unless you have talked to an immigrant today, unless you live in Eagle Pass or Del Rio or the Rio Grande Valley or El Paso or Nogales, or Tijuana, San Diego, you don't experience it day to day. It's not part of your real life. Fox News tells you what's happening. Donald Trump tells you what's happening. Greg Abbott tells you what's happening. The governor here sending the guard to Texas and the border because it's an invasion and we got to shoot him and kill him. They tell you what's happening. So let me tell you what's happening. I live in the largest binational community in the Western Hemisphere, if not the world. El Paso, roughly 1 million. Ciudad Juarez, 1.5 million. 2 countries, 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 nations come together and they form one people. And I mentioned that at the time of that El Paso massacre, we were one of the safest, if not the safest cities in America. Well, we're still one of the safest cities in America. The people that we are apprehending right now, albeit in record numbers, and that should cause us to think about what's happening. They are the most vulnerable, in the most difficult, weakest position of their lives. And they're crossing in between ports of entry. You know, they're not doing it the right way, the legal way, because there is no legal option open for them right now. Put yourself in the shoes of that mother who's just made that 2,000-mile journey, much of that on foot, some of it atop a train with her little 4-year-old daughter. She gets to Ciudad Juarez. She'd like to claim asylum in the United States of America, or apply for a work permit or a guest worker program, or really anything to escape almost certain death for her back home. But there's no path to do it. We have a limited number of asylum interviews every single day at that port of entry. Well, she says, I'll wait. She waits a week. She waits a month. How is she going to find money? How does she feed herself? How does she fend off the cartels who see her and her child as easy prey? They kidnap these kids. And then they send wiring instructions back home to Honduras and say, if you want your granddaughter out of hock, you're going to give us $5,000, $15,000, $20,000. She does exactly what you and I would do. She says, I'm going to take that kid in my arms. And though the governor's put razor wire in the river, drowning devices to try to keep us down, troops with guns on the other side, I'm going to give it my best. I've got to try it. That's what she's saying to herself. Now, no one does it for kicks, for fun, for a vacation, to take your job or my job or your kid's place in school or get the red carpet treatment that somehow those in power think they're getting. They do it because they have no other choice but to do it. And so I talk to these folks. I meet them every day in El Paso. I volunteer for Annunciation House, one of the great Catholic charities that is sheltering so many of these migrants that our Attorney General is now trying to sue out of existence. And I'll tell you, we want them in our country. And for our conscience, and again, for those who follow us, we want to do the right thing right now for the right reasons at the right time. And so the president, though he's done some good things, could do more. He has the ability to parole people in. He has that exclusive executive authority to say, for example, if you're from Venezuela, I don't want you to cross in between ports of entry. Your country is a basket case. I know that you can't stay there. I know that most of you have gone to Colombia. country of like 50 million has taken 3 million refugees. They've taken far more Venezuelans than we have, but we are much larger, much wealthier, much more powerful. But they can't stay in Colombia any longer, so they're starting to come here. The president said, I think this was a smart decision, I want you to do this the right way. I'm gonna use my parole authority. If you're Venezuelan and you come in between this date and this date, you can not only come into this country, I will give you work authorization. So you're not on the public dole, you're not in a shelter, you can feed yourself and your family, pay taxes, and contribute to the greatness of this country and to a booming economy right now. I'd like him to do more of that because we are seeing historic levels of climate change-induced disasters in the Western Hemisphere right now, historic levels of political instability, historic levels of gang power that are terrorizing, killing, and brutally subjugating the people who live in these countries. Now, what I'd like to do, if I had all the power in the world, is make sure that we invested in solutions in these countries, that we brought the leaders of the Americas together, even those that we disagree with, like Venezuela and Cuba, and said, look, we have a hemispheric problem right here. All of us have to pitch in. The United States will lead the way, but we don't want to bear the burden solely on our own. Distribute that a little bit more equitably and fairly, and then try to resolve the underlying political and criminal justice issues in those countries. I know that sounds hard, but even harder is trying to meet the problem when it shows up at our front door at the Texas-Mexico border. We're a big country, capable of great things, but right now we're defined by our smallness. My governor openly musing about shooting migrants. He says, I would do it if the Biden administration wouldn't arrest me. Going after transgender kids as though they're the greatest threat under the sun today. We used to be defined by, can we put a man on the moon in the next 10 years? Can we defeat fascism overseas and save democracy and make it safe in this world again? Right now, we're defined by this smallness. So we've got to change. I'll just tell you, living in El Paso, visiting Eagle Pass, the Rio Grande Valley, Del Rio, it certainly can be tough on those cities because they're taking the entire load right now. So we need solutions, we need leadership, we need change, we need to win big in these elections. Thank you for asking. I'm just going to follow the microphone wherever Stephen has it. So if you raise your hand, you're looking for Stephen, who's in the back. Hi there.
My question was, if Oklahoma is a lot like Texas, where you feel like you're getting beat up in the ring, like loss after loss after loss, and then like with the death of Max Benedict, the state lawmaker calling the queer community killed within days after that, how do you not despair, and how do you not leave?
You know, none of us are immune from the thought. I was really just a few weeks ago, I was walking with my wife, Amy, in this beautiful part of the Franklin Mountains. We're in the Rocky Mountain chain in El Paso. And gorgeous sunset, and you all do this with your spouse or your friend, you start fantasizing about, what if we open a pizza shop next, or do something else that's fun that's not politics? What if we left Texas? We have a 15-year-old daughter. This is not a state that respects her rights. She's able to make her own decisions about her own body, and maybe we should be somewhere else. Maybe we should take a break from politics. We've been doing this for 20 years straight. It's exhausting. In the governor's race, I spent 9 out of every 10 days outside of El Paso, away from my kids and my wife. We've done our time, we've paid our dues, it's somebody else's job. But the more we thought about it, the more we realized that this is where the fight is. And in a way, how lucky to be alive at this moment. Everything that we care about is going to be decided. And we get to be part of the fight. There were other generations at other times who frankly had it pretty easy. And I feel sorry for them. Those generations who fought in World War II and defeated fascism. Those who overcame the Confederacy and made that moment at Appomattox possible. Those who broke our bonds from the British Empire and made the world's greatest democracy a possibility. Those are the generations that we constantly look to. The freedom riders and the John Lewis and Dr. Martin Luther King of the civil rights and voting rights movement. Those are the major epics that we go back to that inspire us. This could very well be the next one. And when I think about it that way, it's absolutely thrilling. And then when I remind myself that there are others who cannot afford to leave the state of Texas, and if we make the most of our luxury, they're left behind with fewer left to fight with them and on their behalf. And then lastly, I mentioned Uvalde earlier, and I was there the day after the shooting, the day that Governor Abbott infamously held a press conference. The first words out of his mouth were, "It could have been worse." 19 kids slaughtered so badly their parents could only identify them by the shoes that they were wearing. 2 of their brave, amazing, beautiful, kind-hearted teachers killed right alongside him. And that is what he said to that community. And those parents who I've stayed in touch with and gotten to know so well, if anyone gets a pass, if anyone is allowed to give in to the temptation to despair, they are the ones. They gave literally everything that mattered to them. And yet those parents, they're in the offices of state legislators every single session since Uvalde happened, a regular session and special session alike. And imagine this fucking strength that they're able to summon and grace that they have. They patiently sit in front of these Republican lawmakers and recount what it is like to lose your child in this way. And they're not asking for the moon. They say, hey, could you raise the age to buy one of these AR-15s to 21? The guy who bought it in Uvalde was 18. He waited patiently for his 18th birthday. If it's 21, 3 more years of some possible intervention in that troubled guy's life. Could we have a red flag law? Because he told everybody he wanted to shoot kids in his school, but there was nothing to stop him from doing that until he did. Could we have a universal background check? We are cool with people buying guns. We just want to make sure that if they have a criminal history or they have some mental health challenges or they've harmed somebody in their lives, that we know about it before it's too late. They're there every single day, fighting against incredibly long odds in Texas. And they never give up, and they always try. Kim Rubio, if you haven't heard her name, follow her on social media. She lost her daughter, Lexi. She just ran for office, for mayor of Uvalde. Sadly, she lost, but you know what? She tried, and I bet you she gave a lot of hope to a lot of people in that deeply conservative community, that if she, of all people, can do that, then who are we not to do our part? So yes, I am tempted to despair, just like everyone else. Yes, some days I'm like, all right, that's it. I'm done. I've had enough. This is too hard. It's too painful. It's too much. But then you just take a moment to collect yourself. You go out there, you knock on some doors, you meet other people, you realize what this is all about, and you come home and you drink an ice cold beer, and you count yourself so lucky to be alive at this moment. Thank you for asking. Appreciate it. Hi.
Friend from Tulsa, remember you?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I love the mouth to see it. I used to do immigration for the United States, so I was opposing people asking for asylum. And now I'm an election official who's really running out of steam. When I heard 72% of Uvalde voted for Abbott after the slaughter, I didn't even, how do you try? And first thing I want you to tell me is, how much did the lady lose by? And then I want to say to you, from the bottom of my heart, you do not know how rare you are. I have lived in Minnesota, in New York City, in Atlanta, in Connecticut, in Oklahoma, in Missouri. And I don't know white people like you. That is a very serious fact. You are very rare, and I wish you could clone yourself, but I don't know how you can ask us to keep going when we see 72% of the people who lost their children vote for it. Where's the hope in that?
Yeah. On this question about how much did Kim Rubio, the mom who lost her daughter Lexi at Robb Elementary in May of 22, how much did she lose? But I don't remember. But she gave it all she could. It's one thing for Beto O'Rourke to lose there and lose in a landslide, but Kim is literally one of their own. And when you meet her, even if you just meet her online, if you see her, she's going to absolutely capture your heart. She testified before Congress not too long after she lost her daughter. And what got me, and it almost makes me cry to recount this, but at the end of her testimony, kind of off script, she says, look, I'm testifying today knowing full well that I will not get my daughter back, but knowing that it's possible that I might save yours. Talk about service and sacrifice and struggle for something bigger than yourself, and in fact, for all of us. So that's pretty inspiring to me, and I don't understand why that's happening in Uvalde. And I've spent a lot of time in that community, even before that shooting, and they're really good people there. But in a state that's had one party control for 30 years, where the party who is in power has instilled such fear in voters about, socialists and open borders and the scary things that Democrats are going to do. And when after decade in power, people become acclimated to it and used to it, and then maybe just assume, I'm not going to vote at all. If you look at the voter turnout in that county, it was actually quite low. So of those who voted, bad for Kim, bad for me, bad for all of us by extension. But there were a lot of people who didn't vote. And those are the ones who sometimes are so voter suppressed and voter intimidated that they cannot cast that ballot. And there are those who are also given into that temptation to despair. It just doesn't matter. Look, we vote, we don't vote, and kids get killed in our schools. Another thing that is hard to believe, but it's true, it's been almost 2 years since that happened. And not a single thing has changed. No law has been passed, no executive action from the governor, nothing to make it any less likely that any other child meet the same fate as those 19 kids on that day. I have 3 kids in the public schools in El Paso. You all have kids in the schools here. You know what I'm talking about. You fear the same thing. You don't have to be a Democrat to feel that way. But I think some people say, now Texas leads the nation in school shootings. I guess there's just nothing that we can do. Now, what's the response to that? Not only is it trying, but it's having conversations with people. It's knocking on their doors. It's getting defeated. It's getting knocked down. It's getting back up. It's going back to those doors, and it's continuing to fight. It's Nixon for 20 years, 20 lonely years in the wilderness, doing the right thing until he finally came through, and in so doing, inspiring others like LBJ to take it even further. So look, I may or may not run again ever for anything, and certainly not for a statewide position in Texas. Who knows? But the runs that we had, Kim Rubio's run in Uvalde, they may have set in motion something else that we'll see in a future election cycle. Someone else who will stand on the shoulders of all those volunteers who knocked on all those doors, all those voters who did vote for us in that election, and ultimately help us overcome and win. I really believe in this country. I really have faith in the work, because what's the alternative? We give in, we give up, we just accept this as our permanent state. And I cannot abide that. I cannot live that. I cannot look my kids in the eye and say, you know what? You're just not important enough to continue to try. They are, and we will. And one day, I promise you, we're going to win. We are. Thank you.
Okay, I see Stephen in the back. We have time for 2 more questions. I've got someone right here and a gentleman at the front. And after that, we're going to proceed to the signing portion of the event. You can hold on to your question. You'll have a little bit of time with Beto at that time. So we're just going to take 2 more questions and we're going to wrap it up.
I was a senior in high school in 1967, which of course was the Vietnam War. And people have forgotten that in those days, you couldn't vote when you were 18, 19, 20. You couldn't register to vote until you were 21. And of course, the people who were dying in Vietnam often were 18, 19, 20-year-olds. And my generation is the generation that really fought to get the vote for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And nowadays, they say that's the least active voting age. And if you would think, including school shootings, if we actually had 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who've just been through 12 years of what do you call it, the shooting drills in all the elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. If they were all voting, what a difference that might make for the country.
Well said. Who has more skin in the game than an 18-year-old? We'll be long gone, and they'll still be around to reap the rewards or bear the brunt of the decisions that we make right now on climate, on guns, on healthcare, on whether we have a democracy. There's more at stake for them than for anyone else. And I know you didn't say this, but for anyone who's thinking it, please do not assume that they're lazy or disinterested or don't care. The most urgent questions I've received at meetings like these have been from young people. They know what time it is, and they know what we have to do if we're going to make it. And they're not here for any BS or spinning or political answers. They're here for solutions. But right now, far too many of them do not see those solutions within elections and within voting. And so all of us have to do a better job of connecting those dots for one another. And when our side, whatever side you're on, is in power, we absolutely have to deliver on our promises. People must see that voting makes a difference, that it changes their lives, that it makes it better. And you're absolutely right. Those who are dying in Vietnam, those who landed on those beaches in Normandy to fight fascism, to defeat it there and protect democracy at home, those who are fighting to make that victory at the courthouse in Appomattox possible, John Lewis, 24 years old, they're always the youngest among us. Not that us older folks don't have a role to play as well, but the ones who are always sacrificing their lives disproportionately are the young ones. And so I think invoking that history of sacrifice and struggle and service and courage, and saying right now the most courageous thing we can do is to be politically involved. And then this, so important. The way we're doing this right now, we do this in high school classrooms and college campuses, and we listen and we have a conversation and we bring new ideas, new perspective into what we're doing and reflect it back in the actions that we take once in power. I really think that is so critical. You know, many of you are old enough to remember or have read about Bobby Kennedy's 1968 campaign. And instead of going to all the usual places, he was going to Native American reservations where voter turnout was really low because they historically have been among the greatest targets of voter suppression, of voter ID laws for which they cannot qualify, of polling locations that are miles, maybe tens, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds from where they live. But he knew because they were unrepresented and even because they were unlikely to vote, he needed to be there. And he was on every college campus that he could be on, and he did not pander to them. He would say to these kids, hey, you rich white kids who are here right now, who got a deferment because you're in college, there's somebody who just took your place and their skin is a little bit darker than yours because they didn't have your good fortune right now. What are you doing to look out for them? He challenged them. I love that about him. I mean, that guy is a political hero of mine, and we need that once again in America. And it's not just up to the candidates. I think it's really up to all of us to do our part. And then this is going to be our last question.
First of all, thank you again for coming to talk to us and say all of this. I think a lot of us that do want to give in to that despair feel like we're losing hope. We did this today. So thank you again for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I work for a nonprofit organization that helps individuals involved in the criminal justice system. We help them by helping navigate the system with them, and we try to provide the right life stabilization resources that they may need to stay out of the system. Today, we had just started our voter registration initiative, where we are basically screening our clients, making sure that they're legally eligible to vote, and we are helping them get registered at the office, making sure they have like their IDs and everything straightened out so they can, get registered. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. If you had any advice, anything you could maybe give regarding that.
Yeah, thank you for the work that you do. I really think that is the Lord's work, literally. I mean, in my faith tradition, that's what we're supposed to be doing. These are the people we're supposed to be focused on. And we did it, so thank you. You probably know this, but it bears repeating. We put more of our own behind bars in this country than does any other place on the planet. So whatever you think about Vladimir Putin or North Korea or Iran, we put more Americans behind bars than they do of their own people. And in this highly incarcerated country, Texas puts more people behind bars than does any other state in the union. And are you number one? For women. All right, well, let's call it a tie for the sake of the argument. We both could be doing a lot better. Disproportionately, those who are serving time tend to be Black and brown. And in Texas, what is the law on marijuana here? Is there medicinal? Is it decriminalized? We don't even have that. So for something that is legal in a majority of the states in the union, you will be locked up in Texas. And again, I just want to make this clear. Chances are you will not be locked up if you look like me. But if you're Black and brown, you're more likely to be the target of police. You're more likely to be stopped and frisked, ultimately apprehended, arrested, incarcerated, and to spend time in prison. Now, to the gentleman's question, then upon release, you have to navigate the bureaucracy and the most Byzantine election laws in the country to restore your right to vote. And no one who's a returning citizen can be blamed for not wanting to get entangled with the law again. You may have heard of an infamous case in Texas. A woman who had spent time behind bars, who was now back again in her community with her family, registered to vote, cast her ballot, and was promptly arrested for doing so because she had not finished the terms of her probation. She didn't know that was the law. Someone said, "I'd like to register you." She said, "Great." She went and voted. No one stopped her from voting. I mean, if she was going to commit a crime to be put behind bars, it probably wasn't going to be to vote. She wasn't trying to fool anybody. 5 years was the sentence that they were asking for her. You don't need to wonder at the color of her skin. So think about how pernicious that is. I mentioned all the other ways that people in power try to suppress the votes of those who are out of power. Well, part of that includes locking people up, because it's not just the population behind bars, it is the population that is released that is notoriously difficult to register for the reasons that I just gave, and absolutely disinclined to participate in the political process. So the work that you're doing, and there's an organization in Texas that is solely focused on re-enfranchising returning citizens who have completed their term in a county, a state, or a federal prison, so that they can participate in our politics and our elections again. As you can imagine, that is a really time-consuming, expensive, laborious process. It's not bringing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people on the rolls. It's bringing dozens or hundreds. But it's really important work if you believe in justice and if you want to change those laws in Texas, where we do not have citizen-led ballot measures. Everything is decided by the legislature, the governor, and the lieutenant governor, and they want to do everything they can, and they have, to keep people from voting, including putting people behind bars, and then upon release, keeping them from being able to participate again. So please keep up the work that you're doing. Understand how closely connected these issues are. Let's make sure that when we say we're fighting for everyone, we really mean everyone. Thank you all for being here today.